Welcome back. This is our next 90-minute session here. Is high-impact reporting on suicide, story behind the story. We are privileged to have four colleagues here who have wrestled in a very deep way, sometimes in long-form journalism, sometimes in a daily news context, with very challenging suicide stories, suicide issues, stories that were challenging in their ethical dimension, stories that were challenging in their narrative dimension, and in their fact-finding dimension. We're going to talk about all of that. Let me just do some quick bios, and again, for the sake of the videotape, even though all of this is in your packet. To my immediate left, Sabrina Rubin Erdely is an award-winning feature writer and investigative journalist based here in Philadelphia. Her work has appeared in Rolling Stone, Self, GQ, The New Yorker, Mother Jones, Glamour, and Men's Health, among other national magazines. Her articles have been anthologized in Best American Crime Reporting and have received a number of awards, including a National Magazine Award nomination. Erdely specializes in long-form narrative writing, especially about crime and health. She's written about con artists, murder investigations, vicious divorces, as opposed to kind divorces, I suppose, power brokers, lovable eccentrics, bioweapons, cults, sexual violence, medical ethics. I could go on. You get the picture. All over the map, among other subjects. To her left is Michael de Yoanna, whom some of you have gotten to know over the course of the last couple of days. Colorado-based freelance reporter and documentary filmmaker. In 2011, he won a National Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative radio reporting. He's the recipient of more than a dozen other professional awards. His work has appeared in Salon.com, The Washington Times, The New York Times Online, and many other places. He's also consulted to several CBS News programs and appeared as an expert on veterans issues on 48 Hours Mystery and NPR's Morning Edition. To his left is Maiken Scott from here, from this wonderful, great radio station, WHYY. She's WHYY's behavioral health reporter and supported by the Scattergood Foundation, for which we are all grateful, and covers a wide variety of topics ranging from new treatments for depression to the impact of foster care on children and the portrayal of mental illness in pop culture. Maiken started working at WHYY in 1997. Her first job here was as producer for the weekly mental health program Voices in the Family with Dr. Dan Gottlieb. She also serves as executive producer for the show. Some of the most memorable shows she's produced with Gottlieb featured interviews with actor Christopher Reeve, mathematician Dr. John Nash, and mindfulness expert John Zabit Khan. She's also produced and hosted several award-winning radio documentaries for WHYY, including Growing Up Big, In the Shadow of 9/11, Healing Healthcare, and Childhood Lost and Found. And finally, Jesse Green, to the far left, contributing editor at New York Magazine since 2008. He's written dozens of cultural features and profiles, as well as a wide range of dramatic stories, including reports on the massacre in Mumbai, a suicide at Dalton, transgender children, and the first Ellis Island immigrant. He previously wrote theater and other arts features for the Arts and Leisure section of the New York Times, while covering broader topics for the Times Magazine. His work has also appeared in many other publications, including The New Yorker, The Washington Post, GQ, and Yale Review. In addition to his journalism, he's the author of The Velveteen Father, An Unexpected Journey to Parenthood. Both ways, yeah. Paging Dr. Freud. A memoir that was named one of the best nonfiction books of the year by the Los Angeles Times Book Review, one of the 10 best memoirs or biographies of the year by Amazon.com, and one of the best parenting books of the year by Child Magazine. It was also the recipient of the Lambda Literary Foundation Prize in the autobiography category. His first novel, Oh Beautiful, which Entertainment Weekly called one of the best novels of the year, was published by Ballantine Books. You have all received work by these folks, and presumably you've all done your homework and read them. I think Ariel is making some copies if they... Or no, not so much. Okay. So presumably you've all done your homework. If not, get online and read while they're talking. What I've asked each of our colleagues to do is take us quite literally behind the scenes of their work and do a sort of how I got the story introduction. Talk about where the story came from, and in particular, the craft challenges, ethical challenges that they faced along the way. The choices they made, what they think they did right, what they might do differently. Just to begin a conversation, each is going to talk for about 10 minutes, briefly describe the piece was and describe a few of the issues they faced. And then we'll open it up to conversation and see where it goes from there. I'd like to ask Sabrina, you to start out with this remarkable piece you did for Rolling Stone.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for having read my story, because I'm sure you all did. I was grateful that anybody read this story. I was worried that I had like the most depressing story that would ever be written on my hands, and nobody was going to read it. So I am very grateful that people did read it. I came across this story. We had read a report that there was a federal lawsuit filed, a civil rights lawsuit, by 6 students against Minnesota's largest school district. And their lawsuit said that their school district had a policy on the books that created a hostile anti-gay environment that resulted in basically unchecked bullying, and that it had made all 6 of their lives a living hell and had driven them to various extremes. Furthermore, this school district had also been the site of a suicide cluster. 9 children over the course of 2 years had killed themselves. And of those 9, 4 of them were either gay or LGBT, or were perceived as such by their classmates. And so my mission became to go out there and see if there was a link between this policy that the school had, if it in fact created a hostile anti-gay environment, if that anti-gay environment did actually create unchecked bullying, if that bullying then contributed to these suicides. I went out there and did a lot of reporting. The story took me 4 months to do, and ultimately discovered that in fact there was a link between all of those things. That the school district happened to have been in Michelle Bachmann's congressional district, and there was a very virulent religious element, like this evangelical element, that had that objected to homosexuality and had helped to put on the books this policy that they call the neutrality policy, and it required all teachers and staff to be neutral on all issues of homosexuality, to basically not acknowledge homosexuality in any way. Teachers and staff did not know how to interpret that policy, especially because the policy had its roots in a much harsher policy, which was called no homo promo, which had basically said that any mention of homosexuality was some kind of insidious way of promoting homosexuality. These evangelicals, they believe that people can be straight kids can be converted into gay kids if they're given enough propaganda. So teachers, afraid for their jobs, afraid of violating the rules, unable to get clarification from the school district, were so fearful of seeming pro-gay in any way that they basically did ignore bullying. They were afraid to intervene in any way for fear of being seen as violating this policy. And it created an atmosphere for these kids where they felt completely unprotected, vulnerable. They were terrorized, and it just made their day-to-day lives just a terrible experience. And so I decided to tell the story somebody along the lines had described it to me, to have these suicides happening one after another, and these weren't all gay kids killing themselves, or kids perceived to be gay killing themselves. There were 9 kids, 4 of them, a startling proportion were gay, but it became, as one expert explained it to me at one point, it became like kids began to feel like the normal response to stress was to take your life, and one kid described it to me as almost like a horror movie. You're trapped in a horror movie. You didn't know who was going to go next. And so even the kids who themselves weren't having problems, they were all traumatized by this experience. So I really wanted to tell this story from a ground level view, what it was like, what it would have been like what it was like to be one of these kids, having this horrible experience, and how an experience like this could drive a child to the brink. I faced a number of challenges in reporting this. There were a couple of distinct reporting challenges, and then a couple of very distinct writing challenges. If anything, the writing was actually far more challenging than the reporting was. The reporting had to be kind of done on 3 different levels. There was the micro reporting of getting that very personal detail from the main characters, and getting to know them. Then there was also, and verifying that these things actually did happen to them. Then I cast my net a little wider, and I needed to verify that this didn't just happen to them or within their schools, but also within the entire district, and that required calling teachers and students and staff throughout the entire district. It was a very large district. And then there was, when I finished with that, and I had all these sort of personal stories, then there was that 3rd level of reporting, which was to understand how this policy was on the books in the first place, how it came to be, and why. It had been on the books in one shape or another, one form or another, for 10 years almost. And so just to understand, who are the people who thought this was a good idea, and why was the school board responsive to them? So that was sort of a more political round of reporting, understanding the school district, the school board, local representatives, all of the people who were all the power people who were involved, including religious leaders. So those were sort of the 3 reporting challenges. Interestingly enough, the one thing that I thought was going to be a challenge really was not, and that was getting people to share that kind of level of detail, going back to the micro level, getting people to open up about their stories, about just this incredibly painful, traumatic, experience. I found that people were really ready to talk. They had been through so much pain, and they were bursting with it. Part of it, I think, also, thank goodness, I've had a lot of practice in asking really sensitive questions, and I really am so grateful for that, because I've never had to ask so many sensitive questions of so many people before. And we can talk later if you want about how to ask those kinds of sensitive questions.
You mentioned the writing challenges. Just say a little bit about that.
I think writing-wise, I had 2 very distinct two interweaving challenges. One was that I sat down at my desk, and I just thought, I had to put all these things together, and I thought, number one, this is the most depressing story that is anybody's ever going to write, and how am I going to write it in such a way that people are actually going to read this? This is an important story. This is the saddest, I almost cursed, I'm sorry. This is the saddest stuff anybody's ever read. So how am I going to write it in such a way that people are actually going to, this is a lot to ask of a reader. In thinking about that, I used as a solution, I used that horror story kind of take on it. Instead of making it a really sad story, I tried to think of it as a horror movie, which helped to inject, which was really more of the experience that the kids had, but it also helped to inject, I think, a feeling of tension that drew you through the piece, that you didn't know, just as the kids in real life didn't know who was next. You didn't know, I toggled between these 2 main characters, and you didn't know which of them, hopefully you didn't know which of them would live and which of them would die. And so I hoped that tension would help to sort of draw you through the piece, so that it wouldn't just be this relentlessly sad piece, but there would be like some suspense there. I also structured the piece in such a way, you know, I wanted it to be the other challenge that I had was that, before I move on, in order to not make it the most depressing piece ever, I wanted to have somebody one of the main characters I intentionally made it somebody who survived, because I wanted to end the piece on a hopeful note, so thus, you know, including Brittany. But the other challenge was that I wanted to go about this in a responsible way. I mean, having met all these kids, I was so acutely aware of what a vulnerable population this was. It was by no means clear that this suicide cluster was over. And the last thing that I wanted was to trigger, you know, some horrible, unwanted event. And I was especially concerned because I already knew going into it that I was intending to violate some of the kind of cardinal rules of reporting on suicide. I was planning on getting into great detail about, you know, some really disturbing things. So I had to make some very deliberate choices in the writing about what I was going to include and what I was not going to include.
Well, maybe when we get to it, we'll talk more about that, and both that intention and how it played out. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I should say that in this session, as in every session we're doing, but maybe in this in particular, there's plenty of room for controversy and argument. We're going to learn from whatever discussions we have today. Maiken, you work in obviously a very different environment from a magazine writer doing 4 months on a long-form piece. You're dealing in a public radio environment with a constantly changing news agenda, and you're trying to package things that fit into there. How have you wrestled this issue into the ground in your work?
Yeah, so before I became a reporter at WHYY, I was a producer here, and producing a mental health show, I did, of course, come in touch with the issue of suicide. Remember one show we did, there's a local filmmaker, Glenn Holston, who did a beautiful documentary about a young gay man who ended up committing suicide. It was called Jim and Bold. And I remember featuring that, speaking to survivors, and so on. So the topic was always familiar to me, but always in that kind of personal sense of speaking about one person or speaking with survivors. Also, just in the time since I've been here, we lost a colleague to suicide. We had another colleague who was about to commit suicide on Facebook. So this topic, as it is for many people, it has always been a personal topic also to me in my own life. So there was that knowledge. Then when I became the behavioral health reporter, I covered stuff like the Out of the Darkness walks, again, a very personal level. Then in 2010, we had an incident here in the region where two teenage girls, I was thinking earlier, this was Al Tompkins' Your Nightmare scenario. Two teenage girls, both beautiful blonde girls, shortly before their prom, made a pact with another girl, stepped in front of a train, and committed suicide. So now, of course, I come into work, the stories everywhere, people are doing exactly what nobody's supposed to do, putting the pictures and the morning teens and the beautiful girls, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and now the national media is swooping in and everybody's there with their cameras. So what do? So of course, I'm one of 1,000 people picking up the phone, and I'm trying to find the right people to talk to. In this situation, you know, there's the public radio advantage that you have, that when you call an expert, they're kind of like, oh, thank goodness, you know, you're with an institution, I know, so you do have that advantage, I won't lie. So that was the moment I thankfully found somebody, some of you met yesterday, Jonathan Singer, who's at Temple University and has studied youth and suicide. And he was really so helpful to me in that moment, because what I wanted to cover was not so much what happened, because everybody already knew what happened. So what I wanted to cover in that moment was, okay, what do the teachers need? What do the parents need? How do parents talk to their teenagers who are reading these stories? What do we do? Was the kind of advice and information I wanted to put out there. So I was connected in that moment with Jonathan Singer and with some other people who do that kind of work. And from that moment on, there was then, unfortunately, another suicide and another suicide in that area, which led to some of that coverage about suicide clusters. Do they exist? Do they not exist? But it brought me to a moment of thinking, okay, how do I get away from this very personal coverage and from this crisis mode coverage to an ongoing model of covering this story? Who are the people who are doing work around prevention? Who are people doing actual scientific studies, which makes the topic a little bit less uncomfortable for people because it's less personal, it's less sensitive, and it is just a scientific approach. What can we do about it? So since then, I've just covered a big variety of different studies. For example, there's a local professor who has developed a brief intervention that can be done in the ER. A lot of people who are suicidal or have attempted suicide end up being re-traumatized in the ER setting, and also sometimes they just hang out in intensive care because nobody knows where to put them, and there's a shortage of psychiatric beds. That's another story. However, this doctor has developed an intervention that can be done by the nurses. That's a safety plan. So once the patient is stabilized, somebody goes in when they are ready and says, okay, what are some things that your family should know, that we should know? What's your situation at home? What do you have in your home? That sounds simple, but it's not done. So I covered that. There was another study Dr. Singer did about talking to people in rural areas about suicide prevention means a different way of talking about guns. So this is a big rural area, and people have guns. So do not ask, do you have a gun in your home? But say, where's your gun? And how do you lock it up? And how do your kids, do not say, make sure your kids don't have access to guns, because these people go hunting with their kids. Know that. So it was basically preparing social workers to work with that population. And there was another study about, preparing teachers how to bring up this subject and on what level teachers experience the issue of suicide. For example, among school social workers, 90% had encountered suicidal youth. 90%. And in elementary school, 7% of school social workers had experienced a death due to suicide in that school. So those are all things that have since come up, and I've been surprised at the amount of work that's being done around this issue. And I found that a good way to keep the topic in the news and also to develop relationships with people that if there is another crisis that I feel like I have to cover, I can call these people, and at this point, they know me, they trust me, and they want to talk to me, and they will talk to me. So that's also really nice. And the last thing I want to say is how sometimes this is a bit of a struggle with your editor, because as we all know, people don't necessarily want to know or talk about suicide, and they'll say stuff like, oh, that's so depressing. Yes, thank you, that's very helpful. So I continuously make the case for covering suicide, and I say, hey, we cover this public health issue, only 1 in 10 people die from that, this. So I have my numbers at the ready at all times, and just last week, I was off duty, somebody was filling in for me, and I said, oh, you should cover the unveiling of the suicide mural in Philadelphia with the website that Jonathan Singer talked about yesterday. And somehow, because I wasn't at the meeting, that story got cast aside, and the reporter was asked to do something else, and I went to my boss and I said, no, please, this is important to me. Again, this affects so and so many people, this is a big deal, we don't cover it enough, we need to cover it. So I just continuously make the case and always have the numbers and just kind of shame people into covering it shamelessly.
That's actually very, very important advice, because a lot of what we do involves pitching editors and producers and colleagues, and knowing to have your case really ready on this subject, because there's so much natural resistance, is a very important piece of advice.
And one last thing that I found really encouraging, when you hear from families, a lot of times when families do decide to comment or to be in a story or something, and they use their name and they put themselves out there, they always tell me that afterward, so many of their friends, their neighbors come up and say, oh, my cousin, my sister, my uncle, my mother, committed suicide. So it really does spark that conversation that doesn't happen when nobody says it. Because it takes one person to make that first step to really talk about it, and it does spark a conversation.
Thank you. Jesse, New York Magazine is in this very interesting position where you straddle depth and sensation. It's a magazine that's not afraid to sort of sell dramatic content, and it's also a place where you get to write long and spend a long time. Talk a little bit about how your work fit into that and sort of where you went with it.
Well, can you hear me? Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like to say that I'm on the tear beat when people ask what beat I'm on. It's like wherever somebody's crying, that's where they send me. So I tend to be the drama person in my life as well. And I actually don't find it to be a contradiction at New York Magazine because I believe it's edited so beautifully that what might seem sensational in other contexts is handled with a great deal of delicacy. And certainly the opportunity to write long is the key difference between what I get to do and what some of the other people here get to do. But like Sabrina, the long form allows you to perhaps be a bad example to other people in terms of violating every single rule that you've been hearing about. And as I sat outside there for a while listening, I was horrified and crossing out every line and picture in this piece that we're going to discuss. But it also made me think about what are the meanings of those guidelines really, and to whom do they apply best? And they're based on sincere desires to improve life, and that's wonderful, but I have some skepticism, I'm sorry to say, about the value of them, particularly in long-form reporting. I think a lot of the guidelines for people who are established journalists who are writing 7,000-word pieces could be boiled down to write well. This story is not typical because I didn't follow any of those rules, although I was aware of them, but also because of the circumstances that led to it. Basically what happened, the facts on the ground were that in February of 2009, a 11th grader at Dalton, which is basically the king of the private schools in New York City on the Upper East Side, jumped out of the window on the 11th floor of the building during school, while the 4th graders were at that moment being led out of the school onto the closed street for their playtime. And the kid was named Teddy Graubard. He was pretty much a certifiable genius. He had mild Asperger's. There was some question about what the relationship might be between that and the suicide. But basically, no one knew what happened. No, he was not known to have had a mental health history other than the mild Asperger's. And the school did not say anything. And for well over a year, everyone in New York who had a kid in private school knew about it, myself included, and no one knew what had happened. It was as if it hadn't happened. And of course, that sends any journalist's antennas way up in the air and quivering. But how do you get that story? So I really wasn't thinking about it. It was pure coincidence. The mother of the boy was very media savvy and had worked for a media consultancy. And her younger son was, in fact, named Clay, after Clay Felker, who was the founder of New York Magazine, and whom she had worked with many, many years ago. So she called a friend who knew someone at New York Magazine, and that person called the editor of New York Magazine, Adam Moss, and Adam Moss said, the tear beat, let's get Jesse. So he said, see if you can find the story. And that's not a typical way that stories happen, but that's what happened in this case. So I spoke to Carla Graubard, the mother of the boy. And it quickly became evident to me that there was a terrible reporting problem here, as well as all of the ethical problems that we've been hearing about, which was that she couldn't say it, but she was under a gag order. She let me know. She indicated it in 100 ways that were hard to miss. But I didn't really understand why or what it meant. And so the beginning of the reporting was, first of all, to question, should I be writing this piece when somebody who is the central character in it cannot appear to have told me anything, and yet I will be reporting things that it might seem to only be possible to come from her. That was quite a riddle. It was solved in the following several ways. This is craft stuff. I don't know if you're that interested in it, but I spoke to some lawyers. She was under a gag order, but her friends weren't. So her friends, to whom she had told everything when it was happening, were not legally bound not to say anything, and they all told me the things she couldn't say. So I was able to get the basic story that way. And I will just tell you, if you haven't read the story in depth yet, what the story turned out to be was the core of the drama, which was, it was a why story, not a who story so much, but a why story. Why, as every suicide story is to some extent, but this in particular because there were no details, and people rightly, I feel, people have a right to know these things. Otherwise, why am I a journalist? If I don't believe that I should be telling these stories, then I shouldn't be writing. That's what I think. So I discovered that the boy had been sick the previous week in school and had missed a lot of classes. I don't know how much you know about a school like Dalton, but it's intensely high pressure, and if you haven't done brain surgery by the time you're applying for college, they basically kick you out. And he was at that level where he was going to go to Harvard or MIT or something like that. But he missed a few classes, and he was panicking about his Latin class. He had a test on Cicero coming up on the day he got back from his illness. And he wasn't ready for it, and he devised a plan to cheat. He apparently, this part's a little unclear, but he got the translations that he was going to need and put them on a thumb drive, or somehow got them in a way that he would have access to them, because as a kid with a special educational program, because of his mild Asperger's, he was allowed to use a laptop on his exams. And during the Latin exam, he was being observed, unbeknownst to him, by the tech people in the school. This policy of observing was not publicized. No one knew about it. He was seen to be copying and pasting translated material from some document he had into the test. The teacher was secretly informed while the test was going on, didn't stop the test, didn't do anything until it was over, at which point he said that at which point he learned that he'd been caught cheating. And 5 minutes later, he was out the window. The school did not tell the mother that that's what had happened. And to me, that's where the center of the story was. But getting the story confirmed when I really couldn't get her to say anything on the record, and when the school could not be approached until the last minute because they would shut down the story in a second, and they tried to once I did approach them. It was very difficult, but I did get everything, and then for reasons I'll explain later if you're interested in how you do these things, I was able to use their tone deafness and their threatening qualities against them in order to get the confirmations I needed, and I did not have to change a single fact in the story. Although I did, at their request, make one change, and that was I did not publish the name of the Latin teacher. I thought they were right, that was an unfair thing to do. So that was the getting of the story. The suicide issues here are many, and I will say that while we all, as Sabrina said, want desperately to avoid any situation where somebody might be encouraged by our reportage to consider the same kinds of behaviors, you simply can't write a story of 7,000 words about someone's loss without particularizing what happened, and maybe that's the same as glamorizing it. However, I would say you can use the limitations of the form to help prevent that by discussing that very issue. So you make that part of the story. Some people say that this is glamorizing. Then you quote a suicide expert about that, and you give them their say, but they're an expert equivalent to any other expert, and have to be treated with, in my opinion, and I'm not meaning to offend anyone, the same journalistic distance that you would if you were speaking to a lobbyist for the aluminum industry. The studies on which they base their findings are only as believable as you find them, and you're the ultimate judge of what you believe you can report. So I spoke to many, I quoted them, I let them have their say, I let them fight, and then I left it up to the reader, but I wasn't going to solve the problem of controversy by having less speech. I was going to solve it by having more speech, and granted, I had the space to do it in. The other thing was a controversy I waded into, and I don't know whether you've discussed it in the previous days here, but I'll just allude to it and we can talk about it more separately, is the idea of impulsive suicide. Has it been talked about?
We talked a little bit about that yesterday.
Basically, as you may know, approximately 10% of suicides are thought, by some experts believe, are impulsive suicides. That is not the result of long-term mental illness or depression, but people who otherwise have no significant history of mental illness and who very quickly, typically within 1 hour or even 5 minutes, make a snap decision and kill themselves. And among the differences between this kind of suicide and the more typical, according to these experts, is that somebody who impulsively tries to commit suicide but fails, well, you're not supposed to say fails, but does not complete the suicide, almost never tries again. Whereas someone who's long-term depressed and suicidal will often repeat and continue until they do commit suicide. Everything I learned about Teddy from his mother, from his friends, and we can also talk about the ethical issues of reporting among kids, minors, and at a school yet, led me to believe that Teddy's suicide was impulsive, and the people who are experts in suicide don't, in public health, like you to talk about the difference between impulsive suicide and other suicide. The people who are experts in suicide itself do not like you to talk about it, for reasons that are understandable if you look into it a little bit. So then you're left again with, what do you do? And my answer is always make that problem part of the narrative. And they can become the kind of lane markers to help you stay safe as you drive through the story. The only other thing I want to say now is that the response to the story. Dalton, well, they were caught. I had also discovered that they had paid her off. I mean, that's why she was under a gag order. Some of the records were public. I found them at the surrogate's court. They didn't know I knew, and when they found out I knew, then they kind of had no choice. They had to talk to me in a way that I could control. But they never admitted publicly that they had done anything wrong. And I have to say, it wasn't their fault that Teddy Graubard killed himself. But you could argue that they could have had policies in place that might have prevented it. And they now do have certain policies. For instance, an agitated kid who's been caught doing something, who has a background where they know that he has mild Asperger's, for instance, but even if they don't, even for a kid who doesn't, is now not just allowed to go off by himself. The teacher, everybody, the kids, the teachers saw him shaking with fear and anger. Nobody stopped him. So now when a kid is in that situation, particularly after having been caught doing something, he's escorted by hand to an adult who has the responsibility of minding him and helping him move down to a calmer level. Many schools, including my kids' school in New York, reviewed their policies on this subject after the story. I was very grateful. This is one of the things you hope for in journalism and rarely get, that actual changes were made. And there was a tremendous amount of commentary online, most of it insane. It's hard to read. A lot of people decided that they would take the opportunity to blame the mother as being a bitch, or just insane theories about how she caused the suicide. And but the response, really the only response that mattered to me, aside from the changes in policy, was the response of the mother, who said that in the 15 months since her son had died, the happiest week she spent was the week that this story was on the newsstands. Because wherever she went around the city, wherever she looked, she saw her son.
Well, thank you. Much to discuss in that. Michael, you have a sort of challenge and privilege, I suppose, of writing about suicide and other issues among a community of people whom you know very well, military.
Right.
That changes things. Talk a little bit about the work and all that.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start, so I'll just start from where I did.
Yeah.
Back in 2005, I was working at an alt-weekly newspaper and down in Colorado Springs, and there are 5 military installations down there. And I hadn't seen a lot of reporting on veterans. I mean, it was the typical kind of story. It'd be the veterans are coming home, big hugs, or they're going back off to be deployed. Most of them started coming back to Colorado Springs in 2004 from Iraq to Fort Carson Army Post. And one of my neighbors was a major in the Army. And I went out drinking with him one night. I decided, well, I have the privilege of being an adult weekly. I get to write long-form stories, so I can maybe just get to know the community first before I start digging into the issue. Because people have been saying to me, there's a bigger story here. There's a costs of war story. I'm like, okay, costs of war. What do you mean? What are the costs of war? So I use that as a meditation and an excuse to go out drinking with my neighbor. And so we went out and we got totally effing faced, And at the end of that night, a lot of stuff had come out about, and it was all convoluted and drunk and weird, but it was also really heavy and scary at the same time. I mean, blood and guts kind of scary stuff. And there was a little bit of rage that I noticed in my neighbor. And that's when I first knew the depth of what soldiers who are returning home are struggling with, men and women. So in 05, 06, I kind of wrote some stories about, found a trend. A lot of soldiers, it had nothing to do with my neighbor, but a lot of, I kept meeting soldiers, one a week, and actually to this day, I can say that I've met one soldier a week since 2005. One soldier, one Marine, one National Guards person, man, woman, one Vietnam vet, one veteran, somebody who was in the military that I didn't know, one a week. And I don't, I haven't even asked for this. If you told me all these years later I'd be sitting here telling you that, I wouldn't have believed it. So I discerned a story in 05, 06, which was, and I'm an investigative guy. So I want mostly numbers. I want to see what the trend is. And, it had started with some soldiers telling me, complaining that they had been kicked out of the Army or they were about to get kicked out of the Army. And if they were going to get kicked out of the Army in the fashion that their commanders wanted, they wouldn't have any benefits. And they had some trouble with conduct in the Army. They were kind of breaking down. And well, why? What's going on? Why are you breaking down? What's stress? And oh, look at my medical record. It says it right there. I have PTSD. So that's how I got into it. I started looking at, well, what is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of them had traumatic brain injuries, and a lot of the ones I interviewed were being kicked out for reasons other than PTSD, like adjustment disorder or personality disorder. So I was the first reporter to jump on that story, and then in came CBS News. In came Daniel Zwerdling with NPR. In came The Nation. In came Dave Phillips eventually came into this story because he was working at the competition across town at the Colorado Springs Gazette. So, you know, but by then I'd moved on from that story a bit and on from my alt weekly into freelancing. And I was known, I was known as one of the people that vets could go to, you know, hey, go talk to him if something's going on, or, you know. So I started collecting stories in kind of a systematic fashion, where I was getting medical records and kind of a little narrative going on, a conversation going with somebody, meeting them for coffee, going out and sitting down with their families, driving long distances all around the country, you know, wherever I could go and sit down with a veteran, I would do it. And eventually I was, you know, I had another story. I was ready for another story. And these documents now we're telling a more scary story. But I wasn't really sure how to piece the story together. And it was that there was now a trend of homicides in Colorado Springs. So things had gotten worse in the 2 years since this first group of soldiers that I had interviewed. There's now a trend of homicides. There was also many suicides among soldiers, and there was also some prescription drug deaths that I identified. Well, my buddy Mark Benjamin, who's an awesome reporter, working at Salon, he and I sat down and we said, okay, you know, well, the reason we got together was because I heard he was working on the story, and I was like, oh no, you know, this is going to happen to me again, because it's happened to me many times. And you know, as a freelancer, boy, you can be out of months and months of work just like that, you know, and that happened to me. Well, you know, I don't want to tell you how many times it's happened to me, and how much work I've done that's been uncompensated, and just cry. You know, I haven't cried over it, but I probably should. So Mark, being a good guy, you know, had his stacks of misery, and I had my stacks of misery. That's what we called them. And we're like, what are we going to do with these stacks of misery? He had about a dozen, I had about a dozen. So we merged our stories, and we came up with a series at Salon called Coming Home, which was, we'll write a story, we'll write a series of stories every day, long-form journalism style, but also kind of vignette-y for a week, and we'll unravel this whole thing. And what we're finding were there were deaths, and these deaths could have been prevented if the Army had done a better job of providing mental health resources to the soldiers at Fort Carson. And you know, there were, you know, we put the details in there in our stories. If somebody had killed themselves on the barracks with a handful of pills, well, that was in the story. If somebody had, and that was Chad Barrett, by the way, and his mother was fine with me doing that. If, you know, if someone slashed their wrists in a bathtub and bled out, and that person was a medic, and his name was Ken Lehman, and his buddies in the Special Forces thought that was okay to put in the story, we put it in the story. Because those details were important. We didn't want to leave readers guessing. Well, you know, when they're in the Army, they have these big guns. I mean, and maybe people will get a vision of Full Metal Jacket in their mind if we don't provide the details. So we thought readers could handle it. You know, green light. One of the challenges in these stories was that we didn't really have the cooperation of the Army, including their psychologists, who were also often implicated in the stories. Including actually one who did cooperate in a way that he didn't want to, was for a second series of stories we had done. There was a soldier who had come forward with a recording, a tape recording of psychologists telling him that basically he was under pressure not to diagnose soldiers with PTSD and to find something else. And so this sergeant was in danger of losing his benefits, and and at a deeper level, having his service in the war almost discounted or ignored, as if it didn't happen. Because to say that he didn't suffer the mental wounds that he had suffered is also to say, well, you must not have experienced the war in the way you said you did. So Mark and I obtained this tape, and certainly did say that we're under pressure not to diagnose soldiers with PTSD, find something else instead. So I called the psychologist up, and he basically admitted all this, which was really fascinating to me. And you know how when sometimes you get one of those interviews and you catch someone, and you just, I don't know, you're on a streak, and you just start the conversation rolling. And it was one of those. And suddenly we were like way deep into him admitting everything that was on that tape. And then he said, well, I'm, at the end of the interview, I'm going to disavow everything in this conversation if this goes to print, and I'm going to disavow that I even talked to you. And I was like, thank God I recorded it, because Colorado's a one-party state. And in instances like that, where you can't really trust anyone, and this guy might not be the most honest fellow, you gotta pull all the tricks out. So, because I was seeking the truth, I wanted to know what had happened. So I've been a thorn in the side of the Army's medical command for quite a while. Right now, the Army the military actually, is still struggling with suicides. We're at record numbers. The Army's going to do another stand down, and they've done several of these, which are these campaigns to bring attention to the ever climbing suicide rate. And so far, all I can say about it is so far these campaigns haven't done what they've intended, or maybe they have. Maybe the rate would even be higher without these campaigns. I don't know, but they certainly haven't stopped the climbing number of suicides. One other issue is just the data. I would say that the numbers that you see for the Army are actually lower than what they probably really are, because they're not counting people who just got out. You got out of the Army yesterday, you kill yourself the next day. That's not in the statistics. So I don't know that the VA is doing a great job of capturing those numbers either. And here's another one, the National Guard. I once called them up to try to get suicide numbers for National Guard, and they told me, well, you're going to have to call all 50 states. And that was, normally I'm up for that kind of a challenge, but I was on to other things.
Embedded in this are actually several great story ideas, and that's another purpose of this panel, of course, is to trigger story ideas. We're going to move for the next little while to a conversation with all of you. I'm going to start by just kicking one off, and then Kate and Ariel or someone will be taking the mics around. I'm going to start with a question to you, Sabrina, just because you're here,
Okay.
which makes it convenient. But it's also about a narrative choice that a couple of you have kind of made reference to in passing, but I want to drill down a little further. You made the very deliberate decision, I think, to describe one child's suicide, Justin's suicide, in some detail, a fairly graphic description of how he was found and the circumstances and the condition in which he was when he was found. And this, as you said, seems to violate a lot of the recommendations from our friends here in this room. But also, I took your saying it breaks the rules, meaning it actually was a challenge to you to decide to do that. Talk about how that choice played out and why you ultimately decided to go that way.
I'd be happy to. And I mean, that was actually the scene that I was referring to when I was talking about that I knew I was going to be violating some of these rules. I knew going into this that if I was really going to, my goal here was to demonstrate how, like in a really immersive way, how the environment that Justin was subjected to and that internalized homophobia would contribute to a kid's suicidal tendencies. And there was no way that I could write that narrative arc without ending in a suicide. So the question then was, well, how am I going to handle the suicide? There was no question in my mind that it was going to be as graphic and real as the rest of the narrative. I mean, it just wouldn't seem... It just wouldn't seem right if I glossed over any of it. It just seemed to me that, like if the whole thing was going to be gritty and real, then I had to make this gritty and real as well. I made other narrative decisions, I was very conscious that I didn't want to romanticize anything, I didn't want to glamorize anything, and so along the way I made other decisions to leave other things out. For example, there were very dramatic things that happened at people's funerals, in front of people's lockers, where there would always be like a shrine that would kind of emerge, their lockers. So I tried to stay away from those kinds of things, but this was the one thing that I just could not avoid. What I decided was that I was going to portray it as realistically as possible, but that I was going to allow the violence to happen off screen. That is to say, like, you weren't going to see him. I wasn't going to try to recreate his actually killing himself. Which just seemed tasteless, in addition to, triggering. But that I was going to show that this was, it was actually a horrifying death. This was not a good death. And everything about it was horrifying. His mother finding him, and the pain that she endured, and then actually seeing him. There were a few details that really jumped out at me, like there were like strafe marks all over his face from where he had tried to claw at the noose, in his final moments, which, may have been his changing his mind, because he was in so much pain or had second thoughts, or maybe it was just some kind of automatic response, who knows. But it just, to me, that was such a telling detail about how this was not some beautiful, peaceful release, from life. This was actually a horrifying death. And I had hoped that a detail like that, I mean, not only did it kind of add to the reading experience, but I would hope that a detail like that would actually, if anything, sort of dissuade somebody who was thinking about killing themselves in such a manner, or killing themselves at all, would say like, hey, I don't want to, I would not want to put myself through something like that.
Okay, good. Jesse, did you briefly?
Yeah, I want to go even a little further than that. I think most people who become journalists don't really like to be told what they can say and what they can't. And I don't. I greatly admire the work of these wonderful people who have devoted their lives to developing this information, and I respect it, but it's just one voice. And in the end, you are the author of your work. And as Sabrina said, if the story needs to go a certain way and in a certain style, then it needs to do that. You remain aware of the risks you're taking, and you try to account for that. But you don't not go there. And
in fairness to our AFSP friends, we should say that one of when their recommendations were first in draft form, they circulated it to many journalists, and one of the reactions was, you know, these can't be guidelines because nobody likes to be told what to do. So they're recommendations, and Wiley may talk about that later. In the room, yeah. Just wait for the mic to find its way to you.
Just a carry-on question to Sabrina. Where did you actually get the details? Were they from police reports or directly from Tammy Justin's mother's mouth? And if so, how did she react to your depiction of Justin and the suicide?
That's a good question. It was from Tammy. It was from Justin's mother. And there were a couple of details that I got from other sources, but it was essentially from Tammy. She was... the fact that she was so forthcoming about all the details was actually one of the reasons why I felt comfortable including such a graphic scene. It was, it was very painful for her to relive that, but she was very generous, if that's the word, in describing it all, and in her willingness to share all those details with me. And when I explained to her why I thought it was important for that scene to be in the piece, she was totally, totally fine with it. She just wanted to make sure, I think, by then I think that she really trusted me, and she felt as though I wasn't using it just for kind of shock value or something. But she felt that if it was in service of the story and telling the larger story and reaching people, then it was important to say.
Mm-hmm. Tara.
This on? Okay, I just wanted to expand on, I'm also a long-form narrative journalist on the Tier Beat, and I appreciated your comment about the context. I haven't thought in the last 2 days, I haven't articulated it that way to myself, the disparity between spot news and long form, because you are providing context. And I struggle with level of detail in almost any story I do. You know, I write about trafficking and sexual violence and the way rape is prosecuted in the criminal justice system and all these things. And specifically when it comes to, say, sexual violence, I feel the context doesn't even end at the perimeters of that particular story that's published that day. It's the larger story of the ways in which euphemisms or glossing over has actually enabled it to thrive, enabled child abuse to thrive, sexual violence to thrive, because nobody wants to address it. So that using graphic detail in that context is a political choice in the other direction of saying, I'm telling the story of what humans do to one another. And when you don't get into that detail, that's when it can, that's kind of encouraging it to happen. So it's more of a comment than a question. So I'm just like, but definitely the idea of the long form story versus, and then the big story versus the spot news, I think is a valuable thing to think about with the guidelines.
Okay, thanks. Who has the mic now? Yes.
A little bit on what Sabrina mentioned earlier about asking sensitive questions. If you have any tips for making somebody a little bit more comfortable with you, how you can elicit an honest, evocative response in a way that is non-manipulative of their feelings when they're going through this tough time, as well as any other panelists who have experience with that.
Anyone? Mike? Trying to.
As everyone on the panel
That's all right. Talk loud.
As everyone has indicated, I think people who have been through traumas, whether the suicide of a loved one or any other trauma, are generally extremely eager to have their stories told. It's part of their healing process, honestly. And the problem for me is to more be on the wary side of not taking advantage of their wish to tell you every detail and have every detail reported. So I'm always operating on the side of kind of looking out for how are they going to feel a couple months down the road when maybe it's not quite such a live hotspot for them. But in general, the same rules that you hear are the same ways you would approach anyone, which is don't euphemize, don't beat around the bush, use the exact proper technical terms, and keep your humanity on display. There's no shame in being a reporter who also can feel and sympathize with what the people are going on, with what's going on for these people. Be in their homes. Look at the pictures they want to show you. Then they will want, if they can see that you understand and appreciate that, they will want to tell you in their terms what the truth is.
Yeah.
Right. I always, is this on? Okay. I always, all right. Should I use this so long? Okay. I always allow a lot of extra time, obviously, and I start by talking from very far away. Because obviously you're coming in, a lot of times in my case, to talk about severe mental illness. You're talking about somebody who is dead, who has maybe committed suicide, or who... So usually I talk to people about a terrible thing that has happened. So I try to go in and start really far away. So if I'm talking about somebody who maybe was 28 when they committed suicide, what were they like as a kid? If it's your kid, so what kind of kid was he? So establish a relationship by going first far away, have a conversation, have a few laughs, and then you can eventually shift gears. But I think that makes it just more human to me, too. You know, not just to them, but it feels, there's nothing that feels, I think, to us cheaper and more horrific to have to go in and say, you know, so what was that like when you saw? It's just wrong. You would never do that. So do what you would do with a friend and have that conversation.
Maybe anything particular for military folks or in the context that you're...
Yeah, the first words out of my mouth are sorry for your loss, and an explanation of why I'm interested in doing the story, how it might fit into a bigger story, and how I will do my hardest work to understand what happened with the individual that I'm writing about. And often what I do is if I'm writing about somebody who's died, for any stories, I remember doing a series on unsolved murders, I did the same thing. I put a picture of that person up on my computer monitor so I can think about that person and remember that I'm writing about somebody who I'm not going to be able to quote, but whose voice may come out in different ways, like through medical records, through what other people are saying about this person, through a note, through their own writings, if they have a blog or something like that, or a Facebook page nowadays. So that's kind of where I begin. Mm-hmm. That's the starting place, and usually from there, it's just what Jesse was saying about you know, you're a journalist, and you're looking at the facts objectively, but at the same time you're a human being, and you have your heart to take care of, and it's okay to feel. It's okay to have feelings while you're working on a story. And it's okay to express those feelings while you're working on a story. So I think that that's given me, it's made me a stronger reporter.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, you know, if you don't mind,
Oh, yeah.
if I could just add one more thing to just about asking sensitive questions, I would say that when you... Is this on now? Oh, great. Surprise. I would say that when you get to the sensitive question, the best way to ask it is in a straightforward, sincere way. Never apologize for the question you're about to ask or for the question you just asked. You'll be tempted to apologize for it because, you know, given how sensitive it is and you know you're about to cause somebody a lot of pain. But that's the worst thing you can possibly do, I think, is all you do is, if you apologize for it, you know, I'm sorry I have to ask this, but all you're doing is injecting discomfort in an awkwardness into the conversation. So best to just be straightforward in your asking, and they will be straightforward in their response. I think that it's very, they really, they really appreciate that. It makes the process a lot smoother. The other thing I would add to just about what they were all saying about being a sympathetic listener is with these Minnesota interviews that I did, very frequently I would ask them, do you need a minute? When they were seeming like they were getting overwhelmed, do you need a minute? Or sometimes if they were really overwhelmed, I'd say, would you like to continue this another time? I know that because people are under deadline, you don't always have that luxury, but nobody ever took me up on that. Everybody wanted to continue talking, but I think just knowing that they had that option and that I wasn't pressing them for, I wasn't like forcing them to talk, it just helped to build up that trust and comfort level that helped to ease the conversation along.
I have too many questions, so what I want to say is I did read the stories, and about Jesse's story. To me, there was nothing. I guess I want to comment again about this tension between the recommendations of the people who represent preventing suicide and being a journalist, since I guess I'm in both camps. And I think it really is a real danger that the recommendations will stifle the conversation. And as a suicide survivor, I so identify with that mother who said the best week was when I saw the story everywhere about my son. I, again, say that it's very important for the story to be told. Now, maybe I'm a little atypical in that some people want to cover it up, but I don't think people should cover it up. And I think it contributes to the problem to cover it up. And the stories need to be told, and they need to be told by the survivors, and other people need to hear them and understand them. And we really need to clarify what's the difference between giving details and glamorizing. And I think that even in this workshop, we gloss over it a little bit too much, like everybody's going to know what glamorizing is, and it's just a matter of not giving the details. Well, it's not just a matter of not giving the details. Sometimes it is appropriate to give the details, as you've just been discussing. And on the other hand, maybe you don't really need to see brain splatter. I mean, we have to be, as journalists, we have to be able to make that discernment and know the difference. But I do think it's also important for us to not be intimidated. I get intimidated very easily, and I felt a little intimidated once I had already done my writing and then found out there were these kind of guidelines or recommendations. And that's my comment. And so one of my main questions was, to Jesse, how did you find out about the real story of the Latin teacher? Was that told to the mother? I think you said that was told to the mother, but you said a year later you knew nothing about this, and you were reporting it so far after the fact. That was really amazing.
Okay, are we on? Yeah. The details of what happened to Teddy in the last hour of his life were withheld from the mother for about a week. The school knew, but as one of her friends said, they're not CSI. It's not typically in their brief to investigate a suicide and figure out what happened, and let alone, their first calls were to their lawyers, and I should tell you, when I first called the school, they connected me before anyone else to their public relations firm, and then their lawyers. And then I finally got the actual people on the phone. So there's a great question of image here. But they did finally tell her. She could not tell me, but she had shared all that information with her friends. So the friends told me. Then I was able to confirm pieces of it with some of Teddy's friends and kids who were in the school that day who agreed to meet with me, they were terrified and insisted that we meet in another part of town in an au bon pain. I don't know why that struck them as maybe foreign intrigue or something. And they thought if it were known that they had contributed to this, that the school would do something with their college recommendations, you know, or somehow ruin their reputation. But I was able to put it together by combining those pieces of information. And I just want to speak very briefly to your larger comment, which I completely agree with, and the question of what is glamorizing. I mean, I agree with the recommendations, you know, vaguely stated, don't glamorize. I mean, as we've all said, the last thing we want is to make suicide seem like a delightful option for people. But what is it? What, you know, I don't believe that it's glamorizing to tell how wonderful the kid was, or how he died, or to show a picture of him. I just don't agree with that. I'm sorry. I do think it's glamorizing and inappropriate to suggest that the end of the story is their death. I think it's, you know, in the movie way of the 50s or something, to leave it at a kind of romantic image that they've ended their pain and there's no repercussion for anyone else. That's wrong. And so I think we've all spent a lot of time making sure that we're covering in great detail the terrible mess and crushing sadness that these acts leave behind. And that, to me, helps deal with the glamorization question.
I think also that there's a relationship between this issue and the last question of getting survivors to talk to you, because both involve handing over a certain amount of control. I mean, you know, at least in your case, you said that Justin's mom was very comfortable, wanted people to have a sense of what this meant. And I think that probably plays into the choice in some way, too. What are our responsibilities to survivors when it comes to graphic detail? Are we leaving the control up to them, or are we just sort of stomping all over? You know, sometimes parents of deceased children have a mission to the world on behalf of them. You think of Emmett Till's mother, who after he was lynched insisted that the body be displayed with its graphic injuries on full public view in the middle of Chicago. Sometimes parents do have that. So there's that piece of, but if you violate a parent, if a parent says, no, please don't do that, then you've got a whole other set of obligations on you. Next question. Yes?
I'm particularly interested in the precarious line between the profession and the personal, and I like what you said, Michael, about we being humans at the end of the day, and it's okay to feel. And I want to bring in a foreign correspondent that I follow very closely, Janine de Yoanna, and she has written a very beautiful memoir where she says that she thought that she had left war and conflict behind, and when she started her family, everything would be okay, but it sort of brought her life down. And I would recommend all of you to read that as well. My question is, how do you deal with the fine line between the professional and the personal, and to what extent has it affected you personally, and how do you deal with it?
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is I haven't always dealt with it very well. You know, a lot of these stories are pretty intense. I've looked into war crimes. I've seen some incredibly disturbing photos. I've heard some incredibly, stories of just total despair. I've met many mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and sons and daughters who have just cried their hearts out to me, and it can take a toll on you. And so last year, I began to look at the, I kind of, the stacks of misery, so I began to look at the other side of the story, which is soldiers who aren't committing suicide, but who've been thinking about it, or have thought about it, or admit it, or who don't admit it, but maybe they did, maybe they probably thought about it, or at least they're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder or something. And a lot of my conversations with veterans, including ones I'm writing about, or whether I'm writing about them or not, let's put it that way, are about suicide. And I kind of put a little note out on Facebook before coming here, and letting them know I was going to be here, and if there was any message that I could bring from those who, for whom the issue of suicide is important. And you know, they really, it's hard to articulate, but they think that the story is that there's hope for people who get to the, you know, on the ledge, people who've been on the ledge. There's hope. And for me, personally, I began a film last year, a documentary film, on veterans who are, have turned to bicycling to heal their wounds, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, also to find freedom if they've lost limbs, on bicycles. And they, gosh, they goaded me in to riding every mile with them. So I went on 3 rides, long treks, and the last one was a ride of 911 miles that began in Colonial Heights, Virginia, and ended in, well, then we went to New York City. It was the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Then we went to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and then we rode to the Pentagon. And it's been really good for me to be surrounded by that energy instead of the other energy that I've, you know, that I'd spent so many years focused on. And in the process of it, I have to say this, you know, because the thing about bicycling, I mean, on one hand, it's a great metaphor, especially in the rollers of Pennsylvania, of the ups and downs of the recovery process. And I'm calling the film Recovering because, you know, there's a recovery, but it's like ongoing. So it's the process of beginning that, and for me, I found that there was some recovering to be done as well. Mm-hmm. And I brought my buddy along, Greg Campbell, who wrote the book Blood Diamonds, as my cinematographer, despite the fact that he'd never worked as a cinematographer before. But I wanted to be backed up by another reporter guy. And Greg had suffered a huge loss himself. His friend Chris Hondros, his best friend growing up, had been killed in Libya earlier that year. And so here we were, all of us, including me, with this pain of despair, in some, this grief, this sense of loss. And then, you know, the junk, what I call the junk drawer of my own mind, my own personal buddies from my punk rock days who killed themselves, a couple there, you know, just my own personal experiences, loss in my own life, my neighbor who died, all this stuff, right? And this year, earlier this year, I said, you know, I probably haven't got it all figured out. Maybe that bicycling has unmoored something in me, that really intense physical activity, which has put me in great shape. I'm in best shape of my life. I eat great. I just got a bicycle racing license, so I'm crazy about bicycling. But inside, something's going on. So I took the step and I went to see a therapist to talk about it. And she told me, you know, have you ever heard of secondary trauma? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard all about it. But I didn't think I had a sense maybe it was happening to me because some friends told me, but I didn't really want to hear that. And by going in and hearing that, I realized that I'm a human being, and that I bring that with me wherever I go. And that's not something, you know, that's not something I can't leave. You know, it was your statement, actually. You had said yesterday to leave the heart at home. And I couldn't do that. And I won't do that. I'll have to bring it with me, because it's in here. And I'm walking out there. So.
Well, thank you. And let's end this with a question for each of the remaining three of you. How do each of you kind of take care of yourselves when you're working on distressing stories, on this story or another extremely distressing story?
That's a good question. You know, I'm not sure how to answer that. I work on a lot of distressing stories. Somehow, while I'm working on it, I'm able to maintain my composure and a kind of clinical distance, even as I'm showing sympathy and I'm feeling it. You know, I'm able to sort of like keep my reporter's head on. But I will say that when the story is over and it comes out, I do deal with, to greater or lesser extents, this kind of, I don't know, this kind of trauma that lingers. Usually I deal with that just by plunging into the next story and just sort of obliterating all thought of it. But with this story that we're discussing today, the Minnesota suicide cluster, I actually, after the story came out, I pretty much fell apart. In retrospect, I realized that I really should have sought professional help. I just thought, you know, I got through this just fine, and you know, and especially, I mean, with the reporting of it, and I'd listened to so many terrible things, you're absorbing so much, and with the writing process, you're putting yourself into these people's shoes, and I just had a very hard time. During the entire time, it was almost like, you know, you go, you're sort of like in work mode. But it was when I finally let the piece go that everything finally kind of sunk in. I had a very, especially also in some ways because the piece had so much impact, thank God. It was very widely read. In the 3 weeks after the story came out, the school district that I wrote about revoked its anti-gay policy and settled the lawsuit that was brought by the 6 living students. And so I felt, in some ways I felt like, and you know, I was just getting like tons and tons of fan mail, like the most emotional mail I've ever gotten in my life. And I felt as though I should like be on top of the world, but instead I could hardly get out of bed. And I felt kind of stupid feeling that way because I felt like this trauma is not mine. You know, like how do I feel? How am I entitled to feel this way? This isn't my pain. You know, like this is the pain of all these other people who legitimately suffered. You know, like what pain did I suffer? Which I think is probably one of those things that was a barrier between me and getting or admitting that I was having a problem or getting any kind of help. And of course there was this feeling of like, oh, I'm the tough reporter. I can handle anything. This isn't really happening to me. So I'm sorry to say I don't really have a good answer to that question.
Captain of the Tier Beat, Jesse?
Well, during the reporting of this story and my other Tier Beat stories, I'm actually not too upset. I feel I can feel the good I'm doing while I'm talking to people because they're living in this terrible place and the outside world is completely alien to them, and it does not match what's in their heads. And for a moment, in talking to you, you're kind of equalizing the pressure between the inside and the outside world. And that feels great to them. And you feel great because you're providing that release and that's kind of bringing into focus two things that were not lining up. but during the writing, when I am basically, I'm not completely out of touch with the people I've been interviewing, I'm checking things and all that, but you start to realize that what you offered to those people was temporary, and you are now living much more, at least I am, living much more deeply in the trauma. Because it's not just hearing about it. I'm now having, in order to write well, especially if you're doing narrative, long form, you really have no choice but to try to go to those feelings. As Sabrina says, you have to admit to yourself that you don't really earn other people's sympathy, or you're just doing somebody else's story. But it is painful, and it forces you to face things that maybe in the normal course of life you don't care to face. So that's when I start to feel really terrible. And although it's a little hard to distinguish that from the terror of the deadline and what the editors are going to think and how much I'm going to have to rewrite and all of that. So what I have to suspend that unhappiness because I have to write. And then, as Sabrina said, when it's done, I collapse. And then I try to get the lightest story possible, like a profile of Dolly Parton was, I think, what came after this one. And that tends to work, and also having kids.
Maiken?
Yeah, I think one good thing to do is just to be aware of what is happening, even as you're there. Like, I've done some coursework on mindfulness meditation that I never completed, and I don't meditate because I can't. It makes me nuts. But what I took away from it was that awareness. So when something is happening, just to take one moment and to notice and to say, okay, this is heavy, this is hard. I'm somebody, I feel like, and I hope this doesn't come across wrongly, but when I interview somebody, it is so personal. It almost feels like you're falling in love with that person. You love them, and you can't help but love them, because you're talking to a mother, you're talking to somebody who's maybe the same age as you, you're talking to somebody who's younger, who's been through so much, and they are sharing it with you, and it's like this intensely emotional moment. And what can you do but love them and be compassionate and be all those things? But then you can still go back and listen to their story 50 times and distill it into a 4-minute piece if I'm lucky. You can still do all that. But know that you have those feelings for them, that you feel very compassionate, and that this is making you sad. Just know those things. And also, I feel that everybody, the people I have really gotten to know, they stay with me, and I feel like I carry them inside. I have their stories, so I have them with me, and that is a heavy burden sometimes, and that's something I'm also mindful of. It's just that I am in some way forever connected with that person. So with each person you forge that deeper connection, which you do in the reporting process, you have them with you, and they have you. Like, this mother will never forget you, because you'll be the guy who told her story. And that is a connection, that you'll have. And on some level, it's like being an OBGYN, and the mom who you were her doctor when you gave birth. Of course, she'll remember you and he won't remember. But so you can't remember everybody, but there are at least, several hundred people that I feel like I will never forget them, and they'll always be with me. And just knowing that, it's rough, but somehow the awareness of it has helped. And then again, switching to different stories and switching mode into what are the solutions, what are some practical things people are doing to deal with the problem. That sometimes I find is just so refreshing.
Well, thank you for that. And we do have a lot of resources on this question on the Dart Center website as well. Self-care, vicarious trauma, all of that sort of stuff. I would like to thank Jesse and Maiken and Michael and Sabrina for a fabulous panel, really rich discussion. Bob Gebbia and Joe Pyle, respectively from AFSP and Scattergood, both have to leave us now at midday. So I'd like to invite you guys up, maybe Bob first, if you have any closing thoughts that otherwise you might give at the end of the day, just come on up to the podium and say whatever you think the room needs to hear, and then Joe after. And I will say, for the record, while these gentlemen are here, that this event would not have happened without both AFSP's support and Scattergood support, and this is part of a continuing series of Philadelphia regional workshops that Scattergood has supported for a couple of years now, and which is a very rich partnership. This is a new partnership with AFSP. I suspect this is not the end of it, but we are grateful to both of you. In fact, could all of you thank our supporters here? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been a terrific morning, and I have to say, I think that those of us from the suicide prevention world, and I wish more had stayed, those who were here yesterday, have as much to learn from you as maybe you have from us, and this has been a great exchange of those ideas. I think we all would agree, this is a complex subject. You heard it yesterday in terms of even the research. It's complicated, and the coverage of it is complicated, and I think we all are grappling with that, and I think having this kind of an exchange is terrific. The one thing I hope two things you'd walk away with is that the suicide prevention world, I hope I'm speaking for that large world, is not looking for censorship, is not looking to hide the stories. Matter of fact, I would say, the second point, we want more coverage. We want this story told. And where we intersect, again, is your charge to go out and tell the truth, or find the truth and tell the truth, really is important to us because we want good information. We want the public to understand this in ways they never have before. So this, I hope, is the beginning of a dialogue, and I'm thrilled that we're able to work together with you to put this on. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
terrific.
So I'm, in an attempt not to be repetitive, I guess one of the things that I wanted to comment on is that the Scattergood Foundation is a Quaker organization. And I guess as I've been sitting here thinking these last 2 days, the Quakers talk about the inner light and shining more light. And I think that my takeaway from this is that, how can you all continue to shine the light? And I think we've talked about this as covering suicide, but also the broader mental health, behavioral health world. I think if you can continue to cover it and shed more light and create more stories, I think that would be great. A couple things that really struck me today, and it's hard for me to sit quiet for 2 days. Bruce and I have had our moments, and so have I with the staff here at HYY. As I struggle on what's philanthropy's role in funding journalism. So I would appreciate any comments and feedback to us as we kind of venture into this world. But I was struck with Al's tension that he created this morning with you all. And I think that we need more of that. And I think when you go back to this issue of light, what creates light is heat. And I think we need more heat on the subject. And I really appreciated the dialogue and the challenging of each other. And I think we need more of that on these issues. We need to be able to, have good debate, argument, and then go write the good story. But I think we need to do that and not feel that we can't have that place for that. So I would ask for that. And recently, as I start to think about where we fit in as a small organization, I think of you all at times, we talk about you as participants. I really think you need to leave here feeling that you're leaders. I'm really not interested in participants anymore. I'm interested in people that want to be part of a leadership role. So I would ask you do that. And a lot of things that Al said this morning really kind of struck me, this whole notion of being claimers, not disclaimers. So I think that's another kind of interesting term. I mean, claim the space, make it yours, figure it out. I think there's tons of failure in what we all do, and you should be encouraged to fail in that way. So, and then I guess I wanted to do a couple of quick plugs that you could give us feedback on. We are really invested with DART in doing this as a continued series. So the question is, what's next for us? We've covered returning vets, we've covered youth and violence, now this topic of suicide. So what's next for us? So if you have thoughts or ideas that you could think would be informative as these 2 days have been and the other days prior, I'd appreciate that, or send feedback to Bruce. The other piece is that we, in partnership with HYY locally, are doing some, I guess, I don't know what the proper word is, we'll call them mini grants on coverage of behavioral health issues. If you go to the HYY website, there's an application there to fund some work on the issue of behavioral health. We also are supporting some youth media projects to get young people interested in how to be better on the reporting side. And we're also trying to figure out a relationship with DART that would also do some mini grants. Again, I don't know what the proper term will be when we're finished with this, but to kind of fund the continued work, because I know that it is difficult to do that. So my email address is jpile@scattergoodfoundation.org, and I think that covers my comments. So I just want to thank you all for seeking the truth and minimizing harm, as it was said this morning.